is where we will be here this morning. Next Sunday is going to mark the 10th anniversary of our Beulah Land Retreats guest house. We hosted our first pastoral guest 10 years ago on May 18th, and it'll be 10 years that we've been hosting pastors and missionaries and their families. Many of you are aware of our ministry, but right now every year we have around 50 pastors, missionaries, their families come and stay at either our guest house or our RV. And as I think about that time, it's amazing, how time just goes by. It's kind of become commonplace to us now where we don't think much about it because it's just part of our everyday life. We'll often have guests in our house, and like somebody's driving down your driveway. It's like that happens all the time. This time of year, we have tons of people drive up and down our driveway all the time. But as I think about that time, and I know I've mentioned it before, it was a very significant time in our family. One of the reasons is because God was calling us from a place that really was comfortable. When we lived in Wisconsin, we lived around Grandma and Grandpa. Anytime we needed babysitters or needed to go somewhere or just wanted a break, Grandma and Grandpa were always willing to watch the kids. We lived in a place where aunts and uncles were there, that any type of tool I needed or equipment, somebody I knew had that. We lived in a beautiful parsonage right next to the church. We lived in a church that things were going well. And God called us to come here, and we really knew nobody in Beulah and Benzonia. We didn't know. We knew one of the pastors a little bit that at that time was in Interlaken, and that's all we knew. And we felt at that time very familiar with the story of Abraham being called from his home country to go to a place where you don't really know that much about. And it was a great test of faith for us, and yet I relate so much with Abram in this as we see the example of how God proved himself faithful. And we're going to start our study. We're in the patriarchs. We're going to be going through Abram, or eventually Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, down to Joseph as we study through the book of Genesis. And the core of this foundation, or the building blocks really of the Jewish faith, and it begins with our study here that we're going to talk about, and that's Abram. We'll be with Abraham the next several weeks as we study this great man of God, this great man of faith. If you remember last week, we left off as Noah and his family were spared because of the ark. They were spared the flood that existed on the whole earth at that time. So Noah starts over with his 3 children and their wives, and basically their descendants begin to spread out. We talked about of the Tower of Babel. And then what happens in Genesis chapter 11 is it records a genealogy basically from Noah down to a man named Terah. Now, if everything is exactly right in the genealogy, it's around 1,500 years. By that I'm meaning sometimes when you study genealogies, it can't be exactly right because they just go from certain things. Sometimes possibly they miss generations. We're not fully sure, but around 1,500 years is what you would take if you calculated that. So from Noah to what we're talking about. So understand in our study of Genesis, in the last 2 weeks, we've covered 3,000 years of time. That's quite a bit. And so it's hard to imagine or fathom that because we live just a very, very short portion of that. It's only been 2,000 years since Jesus was here on the earth. And so this was almost 1,500 years. That's a long time period. The earth is growing in its population. We reach down here to Genesis chapter 11, verse 27. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred, in the Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife, Milcah. And the name of Haran, or the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. This is our first introduction to Abram and Sarai, which we eventually are going to know as Abraham and Sarah. But their name isn't changed just yet. We'll cover that next week, their name change. But here, our first introduction, and what do they say about her? One of the first mentions is she was barren. Very important because that plays a huge role in the story of Abraham and Sarai. Verse 31, Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, we are not told why initially that Terah, Abram's father, left Ur to go to the land of Canaan. For some reason, we don't know if God had originally laid it on Terah's heart and mind to go to Canaan, or if he just heard something about it. We have no idea. All we know is what Scripture tells us. And so he was going to travel there, but instead they hit a place called Haran, which was really quite comfortable, and they decided to settle there. Just to get our biblical understanding, there's a lot of biblical geography that maybe is not that important, but this really is an understanding biblical geography. Of course, you have the land of Canaan, which eventually became the land of Israel. This is the land of Babylon, which is talked about many times. This region right here is very important for Bible history. This here eventually would be kind of the Assyrian nation would eventually be here. And, of course, the Babylonian nation. He started out here somewhere around Ur, which was somewhere near the area of Babylon. And they travel up, and, of course, they travel this way. Now, we can't see it on this map, but this is the main reason right here they don't just take a straight line. Straight line you think would be the easiest until you have to travel through the Arabian desert. You don't want to do that. They would travel in all the trade routes, and even when the Israelites were taken captivity many years later into Babylon, they would have come up basically the same route that existed for really thousands of years because it goes along the Euphrates River. So they find a really nice place, Haran, to basically settle down for their animals to be able to be there, for their family to grow, for their servants. And so Abram is right now from there. He's not from there. He's from Ur, but he goes up to Haran. They settled there. By the way, this is an interesting note in the Old Testament. We're going to see this again today. Does it seem kind of ironic that they settled in Haran, and yet Abram's brother's name who died was Haran? Well, most likely this wasn't named Haran when they moved there, but they named it after Abram's brother. We're going to see that many times in the Bible because what they're doing is when they're writing to the Israelites hundreds of years later, they're using the current name to describe an old place. We still do that today. We would use a current name to describe something that wasn't named that many years ago. So if we were describing, let's say, something that happened in Traverse City, we would say, oh, that happened in Chum's Corner. Well, it wasn't named Chum's Corner to, I don't know when it was named that. I did look that up once, but I can't remember. But if it happened there before that, we would say it happened near Chum's Corner, which if it happened 150 years ago, it wasn't called Chum's Corner. So that's what they do in the Bible is they name certain names. So the reason it's named Haran, not most likely is they named it, they settled there because it was an unsettled land, territory, and they built a city there, named it Haran out of respect for Abram's brother. We're going to see that later today, so I wanted to point that out because you will see that in Scripture several times. What we see, though, from this is that God called Abraham to step out in faith. Abraham is often used in the Bible as the poster child, we would say, for faith. And it begins here as Abram's called to a life of uncertainty. Chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Basically, he's asking him, I want you to leave everything that you know, what you're comfortable with, what you've established. We don't know how long they were there, but probably 15, 20, 25 years. Have any of you ever moved from a house that you've lived there for 20, 25 years? And what's your number one comment as you're loading your vehicle to get ready to move? Vehicles. How did we get all this stuff? We didn't have it when we moved there 25 years ago. But it collects over time because 25 years is a long time. I see this little meme occasionally come up like on Facebook, and it's got this old gentleman, and he takes his son, and he opens the garage door, and it's packed full of stuff. And he says, son, one of these days this will all be yours. And I know with my wife's parents, they have a garage and a pole barn. We're like, get rid of stuff now, take care of it now. But, after a while, of Genesis chapter 12. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed Haran. And Abram took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions they had gathered, and the people they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. So they follow through, and Abram obeys God. We saw this last week with Noah. Noah obeyed God. Here we see Abram obeys God. And what's the result is basically great blessing. And God had promised to Abram the land of Canaan. So let's go back to our map here to understand. They're up here. He says, I want you to go to a land that you don't know about, but I'm going to give it to you. And he's going to give him this land that at that time was known as the land of Canaan. Chapter 12, verse 6. Abram passed through the place at Shechem to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. This is important to understand as well. You'd be amazed how many times when we were in Israel, it talked about, people emphasized, we have a right to this land, because there's a current thought that says, well, Israelites really never lived in the land. It's like, wait a minute, how can you deny, if you look at all the history and all the ancient understanding, here it says God has given this land, and we see first of all, it begins with Abram, as he promises into the land to them, and he goes to what's called the area of Shechem right here. Just so you have an idea, not that you really care that much, but I care because I like it. This is Shechem. Down here now, it wouldn't have looked like that in those days. This is actually the modern city day of Jenin. And actually, no Israelis are allowed to go into Jenin because of the great, it's in the West Bank and the Arab hold on it. But this is taken from Mount Gerizim. This as well as Mount Ebal. We'll look at those later in the Old Testament. But this is the area here of Shechem. And so somewhere here in this valley that Abraham first comes through, he would have come right through here. By the way, it wasn't just Abraham and Sarah. We know that Lot traveled with them, but we read that they had many herds and many people. So it was like kind of a migrating city that they would work together, travel together as they would go. Probably be a slow-moving kind of caravan. They would have tents they would live in, pack up their tents and their animals, and move along. And so Abraham comes down, and he's here in the area of Shechem. Verse 8 says, from there he moved to the hill country on the east coast of Bethel, and he pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed and went still down towards the Negev. And again, I'm doing a lot of biblical geography. If you don't like geography, you can just ignore it. But he continues on. He moves down here. So he goes to Bethel, from Shechem to Bethel. He comes down here and all the way to Hebron and eventually goes down to what's called the Negev, which is kind of the desert in the south. He goes down there, and we're not exactly sure exactly why he travels, probably examining the land. They would move because their animals would graze and they would do the eating. And so that's where we kind of end here in chapter 12. I'm going to skip over much of the rest of chapter 12. Eventually, they go down to Egypt. And Abram lies about Sarai being his sister. If you didn't read the passages, make sure you grab a devotional book or just read along on your own. Again, I skip over a lot of stuff on Sunday morning. But we're going to go up to chapter 13, or down to chapter 13, where we see that God blessed Abram abundantly. Chapter 13, verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. Now Abram was very rich with livestock and in silver and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far to Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning of Bethel and Ai. So again, we see in our map, he goes down to Egypt. Now he travels back up here. Again, they were a much more migrant society in those days, raising animals. Plus, I think he's more trying to find the spot, where do you want me to settle? So he goes back up to Bethel, which is kind of right in the middle of the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. Verse 5. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. So here is a good thing and a bad thing. The Bible says that God was going to bless Abram and all those who cared for him. And God blesses Abram abundantly and blesses his nephew Lot. They have so many animals and they're gaining so much wealth that they really can't all live in the land. Now you say, wait a minute, there's lots of land there. But remember, there were also Canaanites living in the land, so they have to be careful that they're not going to disturb all the original inhabitants of the land. So they have to go to land that other people aren't in at the time. And there's not room for Abraham and Lot and all their animals to dwell together. So we see the blessing that they experience, but we also see in this narrative that Abraham displayed great humility and leadership. Look at verse 8 of chapter 13. Then Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Now this may seem like an obvious point of leadership, but Abram didn't want conflict. It may seem obvious, but there are a lot of leaders who like conflict because for some reason they think they're accomplishing something if there's conflict. And some people say, well, if I'm not causing conflict, I'm doing something, I'm not doing something right or not pushing people. But here we see this example. What does Abram do? He realizes there's a conflict between Lot and his men. Instead of saying, oh, let's see who's going to be stronger, he goes to Lot and says, you know what, there's a problem. Let's have a solution to it. We see some simple examples of leadership in there. And what he does is he gives Lot a choice. This is amazing, the humility of Abraham. Verse 9. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go right. If you take the right hand, I will go to the left. Abram doesn't say, look, I'm in charge, I'm in control, I'll take the best land, and Lot, I'll give you the other. No, what does he do? He says, I'm willing to give you whatever you want. You take one, I'll take the other. It's this humility. Abram is not lording it over his nephew Lot. Instead, he's like, you take whatever, and I'll take the leftover. In a sense, there's not necessarily a leftover, but you take what looks best for you. And I just see what an example to be able to follow. Now, this seems common, I would think, that this is part of leadership, is being willing to humble yourself, being willing to give to others. But, several years ago, my senior pastor when I was in Wisconsin, we had some different philosophies in ministry, and he took me to a pastor's conference once. And we drove up to this pastor conference, and right next to the church, there was a 3-story building with a huge mural of the pastor on this 3-story building. And I'm like, what in the world? Are we going to worship this guy? And then we go to this conference, and that's kind of like what it was. And it was like this guy, and he'd speak, and like, kind of like, all right, I want to hear it from you, how great I am. And he didn't say that directly, but I was like, there's something not right with this. But it's common for people, especially leaders. We want people to look to us. We want the best of everything, to have it all. Abraham here is humbly saying, look, Lot, you take your portion, I'll take the other. So what does Lot do? Lot chooses the well-watered plain. Kind of think about it. You have a kid and you give him a choice. What are you going to have? This thing, this big piece of pie, or this little one? Well, I'll take the big one. I don't think about anybody else. And so he goes ahead, and Lot says, look, I'm going to take the well-watered plain. But this is an interesting thing. Verse 10. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered, everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from one another. Now, for most of you who read this, you'd go along and you picture the Jordan Valley and think it is like this green farm field out here. But after being in Israel for 2 months, I'm like, this is confusing to me. The Jordan Valley, it says here, it's plush and green. If you were to look at it today, even you would see here in the map, now most of it looks brown, which actually, if you go to Israel in March and April and May, there's a lot more green. Some of it here along the plain stays green all the time. But right in this area here, this is the Jordan Valley. And you see a little bit of green, but most of it is really kind of brown and dry. In fact, here is a picture. This is a picture of the Jordan Valley. This picture was actually, I didn't take it this last trip. There'd be a little bit more green, not much. This was taken in June a few years back when I was there. But this is the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River. We come along here, you see just a little bit of green stuff. So what does he mean? Now, I just want to throw this out there. In the verse it says, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. I believe the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah didn't just destroy the cities. I think it changed the whole landscape of what was there. By the way, this is the area that it talks about in the millennial kingdom, that a river is going to flow from Jerusalem down to the Dead Sea. There's going to be basically the Dead Sea, which would have been over here. It's going to turn to a fresh sea. There's going to be trees all along here. It's going to change. Like a garden, very similar to what? Wait a minute. What does it say here? It was like the garden of God. So the Jordan Valley at one day was like the garden of God because of what? It was destroyed. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. But yet one day in the future, God is going to restore this to be somewhat like it was before that, before the sin of men destroyed it. It pictures the whole idea of the fall of man, the destruction of the world, but yet there's that future hope down one day in the future. So here at this time, picture this area. It's hard to picture. Instead of brown, he looks at this area and it's all green. It could also be that the Jordan River overflowed a lot more, just like the Nile does. When the river overflows, it helps water the land. Whatever the case, he chose this land, but it didn't look like this because it says here it was like the garden of God. He chose some of the best spots is what he decided to choose. But in this whole thing that he goes there, Abram takes around the area of Bethel. We're going to see eventually goes down to Hebron. But he was given the promised land. Look at verse 14 of chapter 13. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look to the place where you are, northward or southward or eastward or westward. For all the land that you see, I will give you and your offspring forever. I will make you and your offspring as the dust of the earth. So if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So he goes back to the area right here of Bethel. Again, interesting to note, if you look here, Bethel, it's like the central part of Israel. Even today, you can go to the area of Bethel, and it's very interesting. You can climb up in this tower, and you can look all around you, and on a clear day, which hardly ever happens there in the land of Israel, but on a clear day, you could actually see the Mediterranean Sea as well as easily see the mountains of Jordan, and you can see quite a bit north and quite a bit south. You can't see the whole land of Israel on a clear day even, but you get this big view. And Abram's taken there to Bethel, and he sees this, and God says, I'm giving you this land. Now this is significant because this is part of our whole understanding of biblical history, which understands our redemption process of Jesus, and it begins here at this point. We go, though, to Roman numeral number 3, and we see the great character that Abraham displayed. Chapter 14, what happens is 5 cities, there are 5 cities in the Jordan Valley, Sodom and Gomorrah, and 3 other cities. And they were basically attacked by foreign nations. We've talked about this before. We've studied the Old Testament. I don't want to spend a long time on it. What happens is you attack a nation, and basically they surrender to you, and then they pay high taxes to you. And so that was the purpose of attacking a nation, is basically to get them to pay you taxes many times. So the 5 cities of the Jordan Valley are paying taxes to these other nations. They don't like it. After several years, they rebel. These nations come down because they rebelled, and they decide they're going to destroy these 5 cities of the valley, and we see that Lot was taken captive. Chapter 14, verse 11. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. Very interesting. I want to stop here. You remember it says that Lot was going to build towards, or not build, but he was going to live towards Sodom. But now where is he living? In Sodom. It could be that he fled to the city for safety, but it kind of gives the idea that he settled in this wicked city of Sodom. I think this is a great lesson for us. The Bible tells us that if your right hand offends you, cut it off. Now, I don't think that's a literal understanding. It's the idea of you need to do what you can to avoid yourself falling into sin. And I think one of the first steps that Lot, where he went wrong and faced this, was that he chose to go towards Sodom, and now he's living in it. And I think we see that in the Bible, throughout the Bible, the progression of sin, when we start to go towards those things that aren't good for us, we inch, and soon we find ourselves living it. Have you ever heard somebody say, I don't know how I found myself in the place that I'm in today. I don't know how I got here. Most of the time, it doesn't happen at once. It's not one time that somebody says, you know what, I want to live like a homeless drunk, so today I'm going to start living like a homeless drunk. Doesn't happen that way. Most of the time, it happens little by little by little by little. And really, we see this, the kind of example of Lot. He's there. He's now in there. What happens? He's taken captive. So he's taken away. And we see that Abram delivered Lot from captivity. Verse 13. Then one who escaped came and told Abram, the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, and the brother of Eshcol and of Aner. And they were allies of Abraham. So Abram is living basically now in this region near Hebron. So he's right here near the area of Hebron. It says Hebron twice, but basically that's right where it's at. So he's living there in the region of Hebron. And this at the time, I really kind of believe that the Dead Sea might not have even been dead at that time. It might have been kind of a fertile water, that watered the area. Many people believe actually the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are under the Dead Sea somewhere. Could be somewhere here in this area, part of the Jordan Valley. They're taken captive. Somebody goes, tells Abram, and he finds out that Lot is all the way here near Dan. So he gets his men together, and it's very interesting here. In verse 13, it says, he told Abram the Hebrew. This is the first time in the Bible the word Hebrew is mentioned. We don't know exactly where the name comes from. It also comes from a word that means that he is somebody who travels or goes places. Maybe Abram was called that. Also mean the son of Eber, which Eber was one of the descendants of, or Abram was one of the descendants of Eber. Probably had something to do with the way he spoke. Probably the language that he spoke at that time probably had to do with why he was called the Hebrew. Verse 14, when Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. He brought back all the possessions, and also brought his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and all the women and the people. It says that Abram went and found them originally as far as Dan. This is another one of those things. It wasn't called Dan at the time. It didn't get the name of Dan for hundreds of years later from the tribe of Dan. But he refers to it as Dan to know where the place was. It was near Dan. And very interesting today, if you go there, if you were watching my video, you saw this here. This is actually an area right here where basically is a city that would have been there around 1800, the time of Abram. And this was a city, and very interesting about this city, it has an arched gate over top of it, which is the oldest one found ever in the world. And this is probably what the city would have looked similar to. Of course, it would have been nicer looking, but the city that Abram went to rescue Lot from. So Abram goes out, he cares for Lot, he rescues him from captivity, and then on the way back, what does Abram do? Abram gives a tithe to God. Verse 17. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, and the king of Sodom went out in the to meet him at the valley of Sheva, that is the valley of kings. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of the Most High God. Let's go back to our map again to understand. He comes back all the way from Dan, comes back through to Jerusalem. Most people think that Salem was also what is called now Jerusalem. Again, it wasn't called Jerusalem at the time. It was called Salem at this time. And he goes there, and as he goes by there, what happens is this priest of God. We don't know much about Melchizedek. He's mentioned in Hebrews. There's a lot of guesses and questions, and we only know what Scripture tells us. What we do know is he was a priest of God, and what does Abraham do? He gives him a tithe, a tenth. This is the first example in the Bible of an offering being given to God, besides an animal being sacrificed, an actual physical tenth of what they had given to him. We see the idea of the tenth goes also with the Israelites. I don't believe giving a tenth is a New Testament command, but it does set an example throughout the Old Testament of giving to God, giving back to God. And Abraham does here as he gives a tenth of what he had in this, and he gives it back to this priest of the Most High God. But we also see in here, verse 19, and he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by the God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. He blessed God Most High, who was delivered from your enemies in your hand. And Abraham gave a tenth of everything. Then we see, letter D, that Abram gave glory to God. Verse 21. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. Okay, so let's understand this. Abraham goes, he wins this battle, he gets all the spoil back that was taken from Sodom and Gomorrah and all the other cities, as well as other gain. So he has all this wealth that he gained from this battle. And the king of Sodom said, Look, you know what, you can keep the wealth, just let me have the people that you recaptured. Let me have those back to repopulate our cities. But verse 22. But Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord, the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share. Basically, Abram says this. I told God he would give me the victory. I wasn't going to take anything. Because I don't want people to think that I had the victory in my own power and strength. I want them to know this was God. I did it for him. He's the one who gave me the victory. In conclusion, I want you to ask yourself these questions. First, are you willing to faithfully obey God? Abraham stepped out in faith. Now, I can't tell you what God's call is on your life. There are times, for instance, with my wife. My wife, growing up, many of you don't know this, but she always wanted to be a missionary. That was her desire. In fact, maybe you do, because I've mentioned before when she first met me and was angry at me for a while, she was wanting to go off to be a missionary by herself and never have to see me again, is what she told her mom that she wanted to do. But she wanted to be a missionary. And the ironic thing is God called her to be a pastor at her home church and not even leave her home church for several years. She says, it's so strange because I wanted to go somewhere else, and this is where God has called me. Now, again, God moved her on to here, but the idea is God calls us to different places. Are you willing to faithfully obey God, whatever he calls you to do, wherever he calls you to go? Secondly, are you experiencing God's blessings? Now, understand, just because you have a lot of money doesn't mean God is blessing you, or if you don't have a lot of money doesn't mean God's not blessing you. It's not about finances in the New Testament or possessions. But when you obey God and do what God says, and even here honor God's people, you experience blessings. And lastly, does your life display godly character? See the example of Abraham. What do we see? We see humility. We see him saying, look, God, you're the one who gave me the victory. I don't want people to look to me. He says to Lot, you can have whatever is best. He wants to avoid conflict. These examples of true godly leadership, godly character for all to see. I want everyone to bow your heads, close your eyes. Just take a moment to think of the truths that have been presented. Let God speak to your heart and mind this morning.